I think what we're starting to see is that people are waking up to the idea that these are actually all part of a single conversation about the size of humanity's ecological footprint, and that the conversation is fundamentally about social justice and human survival. And as that starts to happen, what we're seeing is this real broadening of the coalition that's engaged in the conversation. They no longer see it as a discrete, environmental conversation, but they see it as, are we going to have a livable future?
Welcome, everybody. You've joined the Omega webinar with Sam Myers and Howard Frumkin. My name is Stanley Wu, and I'm the coordinator for Omega, and I'm the director of the Resilience Project at Commonweal. Omega is the Resilience Funders Network, a collaborative working on the global polycrisis, and we are delighted to be joined by Sam and Howie today, who have recently published Planetary Health, Protecting Nature to Protect Ourselves. One of the most powerful frames for resilience is the role of human health in the global polycrisis. While this link is core to the work of the Health and the Environmental Funders Network and its global NGO community, is often not sufficiently appreciated in the emerging field of the polycrisis research and advocacy. This webinar is hosted by Michael Lerner, and I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. The webinar is co-hosted by the Millennium Alliance for Humanity and the Biosphere, the Kranz Foresight Analysis Nexus, and the New School at Commonweal. A little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the chat to both panelists and attendees, and we will get to as many questions as we are able to. Please also note that this webinar will be recorded and posted on the Omega website. Now, without further ado, I'll hand it over to Michael Lerner.
Thank you, Stanley, and welcome everyone. I can't keep welcoming all of you who are introducing yourselves, but I'm delighted that we're all here together. We've got a really wonderful group of people joining us, and I'm really thrilled to be talking to Sam Myers and Howard Frumkin. As Stanley said, and I just want to underscore it, human health is one of the most powerful ways of connecting people to the environment or people to the planet. And over 20 years ago, a group of funders, myself included, came to the conclusion that there was environmental grant makers and there was grant makers in health, but there was no funder affinity group working at the interface of health and the environment. So we co-created the Health and Environmental Funders Network, and it proved decisively successful. So likewise today, the health of the earth as a whole and the health of people on the planet is one of the most powerful ways of framing the global polycrisis. And so our two speakers, Sam Myers and Howard Frumkin, have dedicated a lot of their lives to that goal. And they are also the editors of this remarkable book, Planetary Health, Protecting Nature to Protect Ourselves, which is a large format, 500-page multi-author book from Island Press that I recommend highly. I'm going to briefly introduce our speakers, and then we're going to watch a 10-minute video that they've prepared that Sam has just again put into the chat link. So as I introduce them, you might be seeking out that link because we're going to take 10 minutes to watch that video. So Sam studies human health impacts of accelerating disruptions of Earth's natural systems. He is principal research scientist at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and founding director of the Planetary Health Alliance. At the Planetary Health Alliance, he oversees a multi-institutional effort, over 240 organizations in 40 countries, focused on understanding the human health impacts of disrupting Earth's natural systems and translating, as well as quantifying, that impact into resource management decisions globally. He also serves as a commissioner on the Lancet Rockefeller Foundation Commission on Planetary Health. Howard Frumkin is Senior Vice President, newly, of the Trust for Public Land and Professor Emeritus of Environmental and Occupational Health Sciences at the University of Washington School of Public Health, where he served as dean from 2010 to 2016. After serving as dean, he led our Planet, Our Health initiative at the Wellcome Trust in London from 2018 to 2019. Previously, he directed the National Center for Environmental Health and Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, and served as special assistant to the CDC director for climate change and health. So with that, I will turn it briefly over to Sam and Howie just to say hello. And Sam, you can walk us into the link and tell us what we're going to see.
All right, well, thank you so much. It's great to be with all of you today. And thank you so much, Michael and Stanley, for that nice introduction, and even more for opening up your community to Howie and me. We thought we would start in some ways by being more efficient to show you a relatively quick 10-minute video that kind of sets the stage for the field of planetary health, and I think sort of the aspirational quality of what we're hoping to achieve through planetary health work. So I think maybe the best thing is to just start right there and then reconvene. We're putting the link in the chat because it's going to be a lot clearer if you just go directly to it than if we try to stream the video over Zoom. So if you want to go directly to the chat and click on the link and let us know if anyone has trouble, and then we'll reconvene in 10 minutes and I'll make some brief remarks about the field and about the Planetary Health Alliance, and then Howie will follow with some remarks about the work that he's doing at the Trust for Public Land. So why don't we just go ahead and get started with watching the video.
I want to tell you a story. Once there was a breathtakingly beautiful planet with swirling patterns of blue and green and white moving through vast, dark space, a perfect distance from its warming sun to develop an explosion of millions of forms of wild, improbable, interconnected, and unimaginably beautiful life. Late in the pulse of declining and emerging species, a newcomer arrived, neither particularly fast nor fierce, but with an unusually large and complex brain, and began to separate itself from the others. Like all life forms, early humans began to mobilize resources to support their needs. Our ingenuity in doing this exceeded any species the planet had ever known. Mastering tools, harnessing fire, developing agriculture, and domesticating animals, we began to appropriate the rest of nature to meet our needs. Somewhere along the way, we began to tell ourselves a story of human exceptionalism, that we are separate from nature and that the rest of the natural world is ours for the taking. Individuals and entire cultures with stories and ways of life that emphasized living in harmony with nature and protecting the web of life tended to be marginalized or destroyed. Late in the story, we discovered the nearly boundless energy stored in the fossil remains of previous life forms. Burning these fuels exponentially increased our ability to transform landscapes, develop new products and technologies, mine minerals from deep in the ground and sea, fell forests, expand agriculture and food production, transport people and products, and extend fishing to the remotest reaches of the ocean. In the space of less than a century, we became the dominant force shaping Earth's biophysical conditions. Our inventions and discoveries allowed most of humanity to experience breathtaking improvements in education, wealth, and health. Global adult literacy doubled from 1940 to 2015. The percentage of people living in extreme poverty fell from 62% to 10%, despite a nearly threefold increase in the global human population during that time. Average global life expectancy rose from 46 years to 72 years. But the same extraordinary technological and scientific developments that fueled these unimaginable improvements in human development over the course of a single lifetime also accelerated the erosion of our planet's natural systems. In removing ourselves from nature, we've allowed our collective activities to become extreme. To feed ourselves each year, we claim 40% of the world's land surface for croplands and pastures. We appropriate half the accessible fresh water, mostly to irrigate our crops. We've dammed over 60% of the world's rivers and cut down half the temperate and tropical forests. The pollution from our enterprises contaminates air, water, and soil at a global scale and is driving accelerating climate change. Of the total mass of mammals on Earth today, 36% is human beings, 60% is domesticated livestock, 4% is wild mammals. 2/3 of the birds, reptiles, amphibians, fishes, and mammals that used to share the planet with us are gone. 1 million species face extinction, many within decades. In pursuit of our ambitions, all of nature has become collateral damage. But human beings are not disconnected from the rest of the natural world. Planetary health is a rapidly growing transdisciplinary field focused on understanding and addressing the human health impacts of our degradation of natural systems. Planetary health research is teaching us that our dismantling of nature has become an urgent threat to human health and well-being. A rapidly changing climate, loss of biodiversity, pollution of air, water, and soil, deforestation and other land use changes, and scarcity of fresh water and arable land are interacting to affect the foundations of human well-being. The quality and quantity of food we can produce, the quality of air we breathe and water we drink, our exposure to infectious diseases and extreme weather events, even the habitability of the places many of us live. Every dimension of human health is being affected, from nutrition to infectious disease exposure, from non-communicable diseases to mental health. The enormous health gains we've achieved over the last several decades are now threatened by our own transformation of nature's systems. Nor are the health burdens distributed evenly or fairly. When warming causes malaria to move up into the East African highlands, the poorest families who cannot purchase bed nets are most vulnerable. When pollinating insects decline and crop yields fall, the wealthy can afford to purchase fresh fruit and vegetables while the poor suffer higher rates of heart disease, stroke, and certain cancers because of decreased consumption of these foods. When extreme weather and crop failures drive people from their homes, the wealthy are insulated while the poor suffer. Consumption patterns and value systems of the wealthiest people on Earth are putting the poorest people and future generations in harm's way. Awareness around planetary health is moving quickly across the world. From policymakers to the private sector to the general public, we're waking up to what Martin Luther King once described as the fierce urgency of now. To safeguard human health and well-being and to protect the rest of life on Earth will require deep, urgent, structural change in how we live and a global commitment to reversing our degradation of Earth's natural systems. Our growing awakening to this fact holds enormous promise. Looking out across the domains of global food systems, energy systems, manufacturing and the circular economy, urban design and green chemistry, we see a rich landscape of solutions. We can imagine a world 100 years from now where the human population has stabilized as a result of educating girls, creating economic opportunities for women, and providing access to contraception for couples who want it. A world in which we have extended today's remarkable gains in renewable energy technology and moved to a post-combustion energy system. A world where we are producing food and manufactured goods with dramatically reduced ecological inputs. And a world where most of us are living in cities that have been designed to optimize physical, mental, and cultural health while allowing nature to regenerate. The moment we face calls for more than rapid innovation in our technologies and practices. Underneath the ecological crisis we have created and the global health crisis that it is precipitating is a spiritual crisis. We've allowed our myth of human exceptionalism to create a rupture between humanity and the natural world we depend on. The reverence and awe that most of us feel toward nature has lost its authority in guiding our decisions. We will need to weave a new fabric with threads from indigenous knowledge, the world's faith traditions, literature, and the arts that reasserts our spiritual connection to the natural world. Our story of human exceptionalism, of extraction, domination, scarcity, and ultimately extinction will need to give way to new stories and values of interdependence, equity, abundance, regeneration, and renaissance. We find ourselves actors in one of history's greatest dramas. A lone species with an outsized talent for bending the natural world toward our will, spinning through space on a stunning but fragile planet. The same complex brain that has subjugated much of nature is bringing us news that the state of natural systems and the well-being of humanity cannot remain disconnected. We know that people around the world are suffering across every region and every dimension of health. We have the science, stories, and solutions in front of us. We know what to do. Will we do it?
Wonderful. Just wonderful. What a brilliant, brilliant film. So welcome to you both. And we're going to hear from both of you, starting with Sam. So Sam, please take us away.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Let me just get a couple of slides up here. Well, great. I mean, it's been really wonderful to speak with Michael and Stanley and start to understand a little bit about what the Omega Network's been focused on when this work that you've been doing on polycrisis, which I find really, really intriguing and inspiring. And I think, you know, one challenge with the idea of polycrisis is just that it's so complex that it can feel a little bit overwhelming and a little bit hard to know how to bring it into tight focus. And I think, you know, one way that Planetary Health addresses, you know, that challenge is by integrating all of the ways that human activity is transforming nature and focusing that transformation on social justice and human survival, so that it's essentially integrating all of those different kinds of environmental change and bringing them into sharp focus on one thing that just about everybody in the world really cares about, which is their health and the health of their children. And so, you know, as we sort of showed in the video, the core premise of Planetary Health is that the scale of our own collective activities now really exceeds our planet's capacity to either absorb our wastes or to provide the resources that we're using sustainably. And as a result, we're transforming not only the climate system, but driving the sixth mass extinction of life on Earth, changing biogeochemical cycles, land use in, you know, vast ways, driving resource scarcity and polluting air, water, and soil. And that all of these different kinds of human-caused anthropogenic environmental change are interacting with each other in really complex ways that affect the foundational qualities for human health and well-being. So the quality of air we breathe, the quality and quantity of food we produce, exposure to infectious diseases, even the habitability of some of the places that we live. And we're now seeing growing effects across really every dimension of health. And I thought I would share with you just a little bit in a very cursory way about the evidence base at the core of the field of planetary health, because these are not assertions of sort of faith, that there's actually a really rich sort of evidence base beginning to track how changes in our planet's biophysical conditions ultimately come back to affect all of these dimensions of health. So let me see if I can, there we go. I thought I'd tell you just a teeny bit about my own research as a principal research scientist here at the School of Public Health in the field of nutrition. That's one dimension where we're changing the world's biophysical conditions is having major effects on human health and well-being. In our own work, one thing that we've been looking a lot at is how the addition of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere is actually making our food less nutritious. And so over the last 10 years, working with agricultural experts, agronomists who are doing experiments in open field conditions where they elevate the carbon dioxide level inside this ring of carbon dioxide emitting jets, you can actually increase the CO2 level to levels that we expect to see by about the middle of this century. And when you do that and you grow a cultivar of rice or wheat or soy or corn inside the ring, and then you grow the identical cultivar outside the ring, you can isolate the effect of rising carbon dioxide on the crop. And what we've found in the research that we started really in 2010 was that in fact, there are really significant reductions of very important nutrients like iron and zinc and protein in the staple foods, and that we depend on those foods to get adequate intake of those nutrients. And so we've spent the last several years modeling what the impact of these nutrient shifts in our food supply will do to risks of nutrient deficiency. And we're finding that on the order of 150 to 200 million people may be pushed into iron and zinc and protein deficiency simply as a result of our addition of so much carbon dioxide to the atmosphere and this direct effect on the nutrient content of our food. Another area we're working is on pollinator declines, and we've done a fair amount of work showing that when there are insufficient pollinator populations around, you see yield drops of very important crops that we actually rely on to protect us from heart disease, strokes, certain cancers, diabetes. We just submitted a paper actually last week in which we calculated the health effect we're seeing today from not having enough wild pollinators to optimize the yields of crops like fruits and vegetables and nuts and seeds. And we're finding that there are about 500,000 excess deaths annually right now today because of insufficient wild pollinator populations. And of course, as you know, pollinators are one of the sort of life forms that's really under enormous pressure and has been in decline. A third area we're working on is sort of how changes in fisheries, particularly as a result of ocean warming, are changing both the size of fish, the size of fisheries, and also the distribution of fisheries and pulling them away from the tropics and toward the poles. And we found that there are about 1 billion people on the planet who are depending on wild harvested fish to get adequate intakes of critical nutrients like omega-3 fatty acids and iron and zinc and vitamin B12. And most of those people actually live in the tropics where they're starting to lose access to those wild harvested fish populations. So that's just an example from some of our own work, which is sort of a small subset of the other ways in which we're changing the biophysical conditions that underpin the global food supply system. And so you can see there are a whole host of different effects because pretty much all of the conditions that our food production system have been optimized to perform under are now changing at the fastest rates in the history of our species. And of course, you could create a very similarly complex diagram for every other dimension of health, where these biophysical shifts that are being caused by us are now coming back to affect different dimensions of health. So obviously we're very familiar today with the infectious disease pandemic we're seeing from COVID-19, which is most likely from a spillover event, maybe from a bat population. Whether that happened in a lab or happened in a live animal market is still unclear. But we know that we have a fundamentally very risky relationship between people and wildlife populations, which is actually putting us at risk for these spillover events where we get pathogens from wildlife moving into human populations. But that's only one of the many, many mechanisms by which biophysical changes are actually affecting infectious disease exposure, in particular, changes in temperature, changes in soil moisture, changes in the biological composition of communities, all affect particularly vector-borne diseases, but many diseases with very large impacts in terms of the size of the population affected. We're seeing a rise sort of year after year after year in the number of people who are displaced. This year it was up over 80 million people, about half of those are children. And clearly the causes are multifactorial, but accelerating environmental change is one of the things that's causing places where people live to no longer be habitable and driving increasing population displacement, which has really significant effects on health, from undernutrition, from infectious disease epidemics to psychological, sexual, and physical trauma. So a whole host of health effects associated with displacement. The non-communicable diseases are also being affected. And one of the huge issues, obviously, is pollution. The recent Lancet report on pollution and health suggested that somewhere around 9 million excess deaths are occurring annually from pollution of air, water, and soil. But it's not only pollution. We're seeing, as I said, loss of pollinators driving an increased burden of disease from the non-communicable diseases. These women in Bangladesh are at risk for higher rates of eclampsia and hypertension as sea level rise and poor water resource management upstream are pushing more salt water into coastal aquifers, and that increased salinity is directly correlated with higher rates of eclampsia in pregnant women and hypertension in adults. So there are a lot of sort of complex sort of systems-based mechanisms by which our shifting biophysical conditions is actually mediating non-communicable diseases. And then I think we're all increasingly familiar with this issue of mental health effects from global environmental change. And the sort of extreme events are quite intuitive, that the extreme fire episodes that we saw in the Western North America last summer, the extreme hurricane events that we've been seeing in the Caribbean are clearly driving people out of their homes, causing fatalities, and are associated with really high rates of anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, even suicidality. What's been less well studied is the much broader effect across the whole public of what it's being called eco-anxiety or ecological grief. And what is the sort of burden that all of us carry from knowing that our own consumption patterns in the wealthy parts of the world are putting the most vulnerable people in the world in harm's way? What is the burden of knowing that our grandchildren may never see a flourishing coral reef? What are the mental health burdens for indigenous communities in the Arctic or in low-lying Pacific Island nations, coming to grips with the fact that whole traditional ways of life are starting to crumble and may no longer be viable? And these are all questions that really are understudied and need to be addressed more, but it appears that there's some very, very large burdens of disease around these mental health effects. And so just really quickly to sort of summarize what we know from the science about these effects of global change on health is that they're affecting each dimension of health. These are not esoteric or sort of academic examples. They're very, very large burdens of disease associated with these effects. Hundreds of millions of people being affected by different aspects of what I've been talking about, that they represent sort of an integration of many different kinds of environmental change. So it's not only climate change that we need to think about, but it's climate change in the setting of rapid changes in land use and pollution and biodiversity loss. And that finally, there are really, really important issues of justice and equity, that the people who are really bearing the greatest burden from degraded natural systems are often not the people who are most responsible for actually degrading those systems. And so over and over, as we look in the research, what we're seeing is that it's fundamentally really unfair, and that there's a moral imperative to really address the way we're affecting natural systems, which is then putting other people in harm's way. When you think about all of this and you think, so what do you do about it? You know, the planetary health community has been really emphasizing this idea of a great transition, that we need to move all the way upstream and really think about what's driving these fundamental shifts in our natural systems. And so there's a real need for a course correction, that essentially we need a sort of deep, rapid structural shift in how we're living on the planet, which we've been calling the Great Transition, and that includes a lot of sort of innovation and technology and shifts in things like renewable energy and our food system and circular manufacturing and green chemistry. But it also includes sort of culture shift, that we need sort of a cultural renaissance that really rethinks, you know, what we know about what makes us happy, that reasserts a connection to the natural world that may even be a spiritual connection, that we may need to tell ourselves new stories about, you know, our relationship to nature and to each other. And so there's a lot of the sort of software side of this as well that we can talk about. And you know, one of the really important things I think to emphasize is that so many of the things that we sort of are thinking about as part of the Great Transition are things that have immense value in their own, for their own sake. And so cleaner sources of energy, more muscle-powered, you know, locomotion, building cities around people instead of cars. All of those things are really valuable things to do in their own right. So let me sort of pivot and talk really quickly about what we do with the organization, the Planetary Health Alliance. And we started about 6 years ago, which was about the same time that the term planetary health kind of came into the public domain. So it's a very, very young field. And our goal was to really help grow the field globally, to build a rigorous, evidence-based, global, robust field of planetary health. And to start with this evidence base that I was talking about, with this research base, and then around that build a global community of practice, and around that field has started to grow, you know, sort of a movement. And how do we then take all of that and connect it to action? And so I want to show you just a few sort of highlights of what we've been doing. The field has actually been growing incredibly fast over the last 5 or 6 years, with all of these new courses proliferating, degree programs, professorships, lots of new journals in the field, lots of new initiatives. The Alliance itself has grown up over 280 organizations now from 58 different countries. We've got about 11,000 people now subscribing to our newsletter. So the actual engagement has been growing. Michael mentioned this first textbook for the field that we put out. We've also got a series of case studies with teaching notes and an educational framework for the field, and are building out an educational platform to try to support all of these new courses that are starting to proliferate. And we do a lot of community building. So our last annual meeting, we had about 5,000 people registered. It was done with the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. And they came from 130 different countries. So it's been a really, really engaged, rapidly growing community. The next annual meeting will be here at Harvard in 2022 in the fall. We also are working on regional hubs in 10 regions of the world. We have a network of ambassadors on campuses all over the country. We're engaging with clinicians. So there are lots of different ways that we're sort of working on building and engaging this global community of practice. And then increasingly, we're focusing on how we take all of this knowledge and these conceptual frameworks that are emerging from the field of planetary health, and how we connect them to action to make change in the world. And we call that sort of mainstreaming planetary health, with a heavy focus on the private sector, the policy domain, and the general public. And so just in the past sort of year or so, we've been working closely with the World Business Council and Sustainable Development, and a huge coalition of the really large global businesses called Business for Nature, around policy work. We're working with a bunch of individual companies. Just had a course for Bank of America. We're working with other companies that are much more closely in a planetary health space. The United Nations Development Program has really adopted planetary health as a framework and just published its October bulletin around planetary health, and is thinking about planetary health as sort of the frame for its next 3-year health initiative. And so, a whole variety of ways. We're also have been engaged with the G20 meetings, both in Rome this past fall and the upcoming G20 meeting in Jakarta, where planetary health will feature really significantly. So what we're seeing is this sort of very rapid kind of penetration into these different sectors, which is really hopeful in terms of expanding the field. So let me stop there and give Howie a chance to jump in, and then we can have a discussion.
Thank you so much, Sam. Howie, we look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks very much, Sam. Thanks, Michael. Good to be with you all. I see some old friends and some new friends in the chat listing, and it's great to see you all. I'm going to be very quick. I want to be sure we leave time for discussion, but I wanted to pick up on Sam's narrative and tackle the question, what do you actually do? How do you operationalize planetary health? Can you get a job doing planetary health? Can you practically apply some of the principles that Sam talked about? I'm going to go more quickly than I planned to be sure that we leave enough time, but I don't want to skip acknowledging that I'm speaking from the traditional unceded land of the Coast Salish peoples here in the Pacific Northwest, the land that touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Puyallup, Squamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. I honor that land with gratitude and the people who live on it. Well, when we teach planetary health, at least when I do, I very much acknowledge the polycrisis, but I also think in terms of polysolutions. I think that's one of the great offerings of planetary health thinking. Never focus on just one issue, I tell my students. Never solve just one problem. Never think just in the present tense. And so having left the academic world, actually remaining as a professor emeritus, which the Latin scholars in the crowd will remember means a professor without merit, and that's a perfect job description. I went over to an NGO thinking that work in civil society would be a good way to advance these principles. And I joined the Trust for Public Land a short time ago. So I'm not here today to plug a particular organization, but I think it offers a good example of how planetary health can be put into practice. Is land the only platform? Not at all. I could just as happily have worked on transportation or on food or on urban design, but land is a really interesting platform. So I'm just going to show you 3 examples of work at TPL and show you how that work embodies planetary health. It's an especially good setting for me because the strategic goals of the Trust for Public Land are 4. Climate action, health, equity, and community building. And so what better way to advance the principles we've been talking about this morning? The first example I want to talk about comes from the great state of Maine. In this central part of Maine, actually in the northern part of Maine, there is a place called the Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument. Trust for Public Land helped to create this over the last decade, and the origin story is a very interesting one. It began with the efforts of a conservationist by the name of Roxanne Quimby, who had resources and began purchasing land with the idea of creating a public conservation space. She eventually accumulated almost 100,000 acres of land in northern Maine in the location that I just showed you. There was considerable opposition locally to turning that land into a park. The opposition came from snowmobilers, from hunters, from those who oppose federal ownership of land, from truculent conservatives. And the argument arose that taking rural areas that are moving away from an extractive economy and implanting in those areas a recreation-based economy, tourist and recreation economy, could be a sustainable way to revive the local economy. And so arguments pro and con were developed. People took sides. The tribes locally eventually came round. Lucas St. Clair, who is the son of Roxanne Quimby and emerged as a major champion for this effort, eventually took it over from his mother, uh, ran for Congress on the platform that rebuilding the rural economy through land conservation was both the environmentally sensible thing to do and the economically sensible thing to do. Lucas ran into some conflicts with the governor and others along the way. Uh, Eventually, one of the important levers was economic studies showing that the national park would actually provide many more jobs and much more economic stimulus than would sticking with the extractive economy that had been typical for Maine. And it turns out this is a thing, that one of the ways to shepherd and steward rural land and to promote the health and well-being of the people who live there is through a recreational economy. There's good economic data to support that notion. And so eventually that was what happened. And in 2016, on the 100th anniversary of the National Park Service, President Obama designated that land as a national monument. And that is probably a step on the path toward a national park. But even today, you can go to visit the Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument. And in follow-up economic studies, it turns out that tourism, even through this era of COVID, has infused the area with substantial resources, which in turn helps to overcome the depression, and I mean that both economically and psychologically, that afflicts the people in that part of the state since the decline of the extractive forestry economy. Let me move down from that large spatial scale to my second example, which is cityscapes. I want to tell you about a project called Urban Drawdown. It's a little bit of an unfortunately named project. It took the name Drawdown from Paul Hawkins' legacy and organization without actually asking for permission. But this is a project of the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, and the Trust for Public Land that's dedicated to the notion that you can use natural systems within cities to help tackle the climate crisis. There is, of course, some data suggesting that urban forests can draw down carbon, but they are a small part of the overall natural drawdown of carbon relative to rural lands, forests, peat, grasslands, and so on. But if you combine the drawdown benefits of urban forest with the many other benefits of natural infrastructure in cities, reducing the urban heat island, reducing noise, improving air quality, providing recreational and spiritual opportunities for the people who live in cities, then the notion that urban landscapes can be a very important tool for the betterment both of the natural world and the people who live in it is a very compelling notion. Third example on the smallest spatial scale that I'll discuss, and this is the notion of green schoolyards, which is a major initiative for the Trust for Public Land. This is a picture of a schoolyard. It's a very typical picture in many cities across the country, in particular in resource-poor neighborhoods. If you aspirationally create green schoolyards, as you see here, or here, or here, that provides a range of benefits for the people who live there. Now, we haven't fully documented these benefits. Part of my role at TPL is going to be to assemble the evidence to help drive this kind of work. But what we have preliminary evidence to suggest is that putting in green schoolyards improves academic performance of children in schools. It improves satisfaction among teachers and reduces teacher turnover. It improves physical activity and therefore health in children. It cools the schoolyards. Schoolyards like the first one that I showed you can be extremely hot during hot weather, but these can cool the schoolyards. And importantly, if you conceive of green schoolyards as community schoolyards, and if they do double duty as neighborhood parks through what are called dual use agreements, then you improve social capital in the neighborhood and reduce crime in the neighborhood. So a whole range of what I might call poly solutions stemming from the simple act of greening schoolyards. We're now calling them community schoolyards, not green schoolyards, to connote that they spin off benefits not only for the schools, but for the communities that they're in. So here are three examples from the large spatial scale of 100,000 acres in Maine to the intermediate spatial scale of cities to the smaller spatial scale of individual schoolyards, all illustrating how the use of land, the deployment of land in the service of poly solutions to planetary health challenges can make a major difference both for the natural world and for the people who inhabit the world. I'm going to stop at that point and turn it back over to you, Michael, and hope we have plenty of time for discussion.
Thank you, Howie, and thank you, Sam. We have about 9 minutes for discussion, so, but I think our real goal here has been achieved already, which is to introduce planetary health as one of the fundamental frames for the community of funders and NGOs and other colleagues who are assembling around global polycrisis work. And what I would say from my perspective is that I think that planetary health has immense power as a frame, but it is one of the frames that polycrisis analysis suggests are possible. In other words, it has tremendous power and it is a sectoral frame. And so I think you have both shown us how powerful that frame is. So Sam, what I would like to do is to go to, you've given us an overview of the Planetary Health Alliance and two things. One, from the funder perspective, you and I have talked about this before, even though this is Harvard-based, global in reach, very impressive, it's actually hard to find resources to continue the work. So what that suggests to me is that we have a lot of work to do to build awareness in the funder community of the importance of focusing on planetary health, the polycrisis, however we frame it. So I think it would be useful for us to spend a few minutes on, I mean, you showed the scope of it, but how's it actually going? And the second question I would have is that since you started it, COVID showed up and the climate crisis went critical. So you have these two poster children for the polycrisis, by no means the only one. I mean, now we have supply chain issues and we have the shortage of urea in your field of ag work, the urea shortage, which comes out of the changes in oil and gas production, is affecting fertilizer availability and all kinds of things. But with this acceleration of the polycrisis, how is it affecting what you see on the ground and in your work with the Planetary Health Alliance?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, it is hard to sort of find funding for the Planetary Health Alliance, and I think it's exciting to speak with your community because part of the problem is that a lot of funders are sectoral. They want to fund a vitamin A supplementation program, a piped water project in sub-Saharan Africa, a very sort of discrete sort of downstream intervention. And the recognition that in some ways, as long as we're staying way downstream and we're doing things in a sectoral way, we're actually not going to meet the moment that we're in, is reserved as a sort of recognition to a relatively small community. And so a lot of what we're trying to do with the Planetary Health Alliance is actually change the global conversation and help the world see that we need to move way upstream in thinking about this idea of the great transition. In terms of the moment that we're in and the pandemic and the blowing up of the climate crisis, I think what's happening is that we're getting enormous traction in our goal of sort of mainstreaming planetary health, in part because of those events. So what I think is happening right before our eyes, just in the last sort of 3 to 6 months, is that what have been viewed as a sort of series of very discrete conversations about particular environmental problems. There's been a climate conversation for decades, and there's been a biodiversity conversation, an Arctic conversation, a desertification conversation, a pollution conversation, and oceans. I think what we're starting to see is that people are waking up to the idea that these are actually all part of a single conversation about the size of humanity's ecological footprint, and that the conversation is fundamentally about social justice and human survival. And as that starts to happen, what we're seeing is this real broadening of the coalition that's engaged in the conversation. They no longer see it as a discrete, environmental conversation, but they see it as, are we going to have a livable future? And so that's been really exciting in the sense that there's just this huge interest, and we're getting, now in the last 3 months, just all of these sort of national level outreach around education, research, building networks. We're convening a huge group of European partners in the next month to create a European hub for planetary health. So that's all happening, but the number of sort of funders and foundations that have identified planetary health as a priority is basically, maybe one, which is our current funder, the Wellcome Trust, and even they have made a sort of shift to focus more on climate. So there's a gap between the kind of recognition and the uptake in the world and the recognition among funders that this is this sort of frame shift, this paradigm shift in how we think about the moment we're in, really needs to be supported with the kind of field building that an organization like ours is doing.
Yeah, I mean, my little elevator speech is that there are hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of foundations supporting hundreds of thousands of NGOs working on almost every silo issue under the sun. There are very few foundations and very few NGOs working on the whole enchilada of the polycrisis or, planetary health. Howie, I want to go to you because I think all of us are familiar with the idea that the polycrisis is what in sociology is called a wicked problem. A wicked problem being one that it's really almost impossible to solve because almost any intervention that you may try to do, you don't know how it's going to actually work out. So here we have in the work that you and Sam have done on planetary health, a wicked problem, the polycrisis, that's constantly changing and evolving. The terms of it are evolving. And so both your work at TPL and the work you and Sam have done on planetary health are critical ventures. But as somebody who's thought about this as an academic, I'm sure Sam has too, how do you square the fact that it's a wicked problem that we can't solve, but essentially we can only navigate with the sets of parameters that you put out in the planetary health book as here's the solution, here's the way to go. How do you square solution-based work, even at a planetary level, with the fact that this is a wicked problem and it's so difficult to figure out?
It's maybe the most fundamental question we have to think about, Michael.
Yeah.
Thank you for asking it. I think that you talked about a minute ago the importance of dealing with the whole enchilada, how funders haven't been funding the whole enchilada. You used one of my favorite Mexican foods as a metaphor for complexity. The problem is that the human mind isn't really well wired for dealing with that much complexity, both at the cognitive level of holding many variables in mind at one time, or at the affective level of feeling that a problem is tractable and manageable when it's immense. So there's sort of a variant of the old think globally, act locally mantra, which maybe is think in terms of complexity, but work on something that you can actually get your arms around. It's psychologically nourishing to be able to solve problems. People may not feel comfortable setting out to lower CO2 emissions to comply with a 1.5-degree target. People can feel ambitious, aspirational, and engaged if they deal with implementing a local ordinance to shift from gas to electricity in homes, or saving a local piece of land, or something like that. So I think there's an educational challenge, which is to teach people to be systems thinkers, and then to let that thinking inform specific actions they'll take. And I think for funders, the challenge is very similar, to think in systems ways, but invest money in specific actions
In specific
that will move
area.
us toward
Yeah.
the solutions.
We are at the top of the hour. Sam and Howie, I want to thank you both. We will capture the chat and send it out with to all of you who've been here. The chat's been great. And Sam and Howie, thank you for the incredible work you have done on planetary health as a frame for approaching the polycrisis from a health perspective. And we very much look forward to continuing to work and explore with you both. So going back to Stanley with our gratitude.
Thank you so much, Sam. Thank you so much, Howie. Thank you, Michael. And thank you all for joining us. We appreciate you being here, and the recording will be made available on omega.ngo and at the New School at Commonweal. If you're interested in receiving more invitations like this, you can register on our website. And we look forward to seeing you at our next public event, which will be held on January 12th, which will be on the global energy disruption with Francois Xavier. And we will share more information with you all shortly. Thank you so much.